Hello, good evening. Good evening. Wow, everyone can hear us okay? Yes. Yeah, brilliant. Oh, this is great. What a fantastic turnout. Thank you all so much for coming tonight. We really appreciate it. So it's a great pleasure to welcome you all to the British Library this evening for When Black Women Lead, Power in a Changing World, an evening of conversation on the role of Black women in leadership. This event is in association with SIDENSI, an initiative founded by Professor Wangui Wagoro, which promotes the importance of language, translation, and intercultural dialogue to transform society. So I am Fatimah Kelleher, and I will be your moderator for tonight. And we would like to also extend a very special welcome to those of you who are joining us online. We hope that you enjoy the evening as well. We will be taking questions after our conversation, so for our online and in-house audiences. So if you're watching online, you can submit your questions using the question box below the video. And for our audience in the theatre, raise your hand and a microphone will come to you. But take an opportunity as we're talking to start thinking about what your questions would be in advance. So just a couple of housekeeping points. For our live audience, do please turn off your mobile phones or put them on silent. And we are not expecting any fire alarms this evening. So if you hear one, it's real. And make your way in a calm and non-panicked manner to the exits. And I'm sure we'll all be fine. And so tonight, I have got an unbelievable panel with me, as I'm sure you can all see. I've got 3 stellar-level thinkers and doers who'll be drawing from their real-world experiences to discuss critical questions around Black women's leadership tonight. So first of all, we have Diane Abbott MP. So Diane made history in 1987 as the first Black woman elected to the British Parliament. Yeah. Over her distinguished career, she's been a strong advocate for global justice, human rights, peace, and security. And from 2015 to 2019, she held prominent roles in the Labour Party, including Shadow International Development Secretary, Shadow Secretary of State for Health, and Shadow Home Secretary. Her biography, A Woman Like Me, and I have them all here so that you can become familiar with them, right here, reflects her personal journey as the daughter of Windrush immigrants and her trailblazing career in British politics, earning her the title of Mother of the House. Yeah. So next up, we have Professor Carole Boyce Davies, who is a professor, who is a professor of Africana Studies and Literatures in English at Cornell University, specializing in African diaspora, Black feminist theories, and Black women's writings. Her book, Black Women's Rights, Leadership and the Circularities of Power, examines the leadership styles of women of African descent globally. She explores the leadership of figures such as Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, Shirley Chisholm, Marielle Franco, and Mia Motley, highlighting their contributions to new models of leadership, particularly in the Caribbean. Through these examples, she emphasizes the significance of Black women in shaping global and political change. Professor Boyce Davies. Thank you. Thank you so much. And then we also have with us Jessica Horn. Who is an East African feminist writer and practitioner. She pioneered the Futures Initiative of the African Women's Development Fund and became the first African woman to lead the Ford Foundation's East Africa office. She co-founded Our Africa, a platform of African women's voices on open democracy, and she served as commissioner on the Lancet Commission on Gender and Global Health and co-founded the African Feminist Forum. Her new book, African Feminist Praxis, Cartographies of Liberatory World-Making, explores African feminist principles focusing on kinship, courage, pleasure, care, and memory. Jessica Horn. So, let's get started on this.
Wow, I feel better.
Yeah? Good.
Or you can go to somebody else if you like.
Okay, shall I start? No problem. So we're going to start off with an opening question to give each of our panelists an opportunity to really just sort of address why we are here. You know, why are we having this conversation? So that first opening question, and I will start with you, Jessica, if that's okay, is why is it important for us to have a conversation about Black women's leadership, but why especially now?
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Fatima. A pleasure to be with all of you online and in person, and of course an absolute honor to be with the women that I'm seated next to. I think sometimes we take it for granted. Of course, if this was an African environment, you would be the honorable. And we do need to be in better practice of giving full respect, actually, to the level and the quality of labor and the leadership that we have here. And so I deeply appreciate both of what you have done in terms of what it offers me and what it offers us as, transformative praxis. Mm-hmm. This world is in a very interesting situation. I think you all agree.
Wow.
But it's not unprecedented. We obviously have a rise of a very particular kind of authoritarianism, and we must remember that authoritarianism is always patriarchal, always, but that actually it's kind of a resurgence of an almost anachronistic white supremacy. And some of the characters that we're seeing coming back on our stages is a surprise, but it's a deep white supremacy. Mm-hmm. We're also dealing with a world that's shifting in terms of how power is structured and a multipolarity, which is actually very interesting from a Black vantage point. Because it also means that powers in the global majority are actually coming into the fore in a way that, that is different. And it's actually opening space for perhaps different kinds of formations. And there we actually do see Black women's leadership, including some of the names that you mentioned, profiled in Dr. Davies' book. So we, again, multipolarity, of course, set against the context of environmental crisis. And we know that this environmental crisis is created by us. And it's created by us because of an insatiable desire to consume. The tech, which, is fueling a deep extractivism. And sort of we say we're concerned about Congo. Of course, the history of that links all the way to the tech, right? And to the minerals that are needed to actually perpetuate all the devices and the things that we have. And we're also seeing a demographic shift. By 2030, 1 in 5 people in this world will be an African, which means that 1 in 10 people in this world will be an African woman. And so my question is, how much do we know about African women's lives and African women's histories? So I started to write this book on African feminist praxis because I was concerned about absences. And I wanted to do a process actually of being able to document and honor. And I think what's really fascinating, and I think in this conversation we'll see, is that what's beautiful about what Black feminisms coming from the African continent, for example, offer, is a praxis, which means both a system of thinking or analysis and action that actually is able to understand this very complex state of the world, but also able to propose ways to change it, because we always have. And the things that I'm talking about, like I said, all have a history. They're not unprecedented. And African feminists have always been engaged in the process of trying to grapple with these complex power, oppressive systems of power that interrelate, and figuring out ways to make space, sometimes to actually even subvert them or override them successfully, at least for a short period, sometimes more durably. And so I think it's something that we need to be paying serious attention to.
Mm-hmm. That's great.
If I can come to you.
For sure. Well, you know, basically and a joy being here and being back with you again, talking about this really important topic. From the start of the century, we've had an increase of women's obvious participation at the highest levels of leadership. So it moved from like 6% of women in political power to close to 22% around this time. It shifts a little bit, which is still low. My book has argued that women represent half the world and therefore have a right to half the world's resources, but also political decisions and all of the other related factors, which has not happened. So we are satisfied often when we see one person in political power and be happy. Of course, this is the first person who has done this and so on, but that's really not enough. So I am arguing that we really need to push for more representation. What we are seeing now, though, is a backlash against that rise of Black women in political leadership. And it happens all the time. Once you have that certain advance, you're going to have a backlash. So I want us not to feel that this is the end of it, actually be right in the middle of a transformative period, and therefore you will see the highs and lows taking place. The current global movement towards a kind of apartheid is really shocking, but we keep saying that we've seen versions of this before, and then we've moved beyond them as well. So I'm hoping that we can keep that locking in of a progressive logic to the outcome of all of this, rather than seeing this period that we're in right now for what it is. And I'm hoping that is a good way to respond to that.
Thank you. Then if I can come to you, Diane, how would you address this question?
I think that we live in quite remarkable times, and I speak as someone that's based in Western Europe, because what you're seeing is a rise of right-wing politics and racist right-wing politics across Western Europe and North America. And if we don't come together, and if we don't fight, the gains we've seen in our lifetimes will get rolled back. So if you look at Western Europe, Italy has a prime minister who literally is a neo-fascist. Her party is a fascist party. She's changed the name, that's what it is. You've seen the rise of right-wing parties, far-right parties, in Germany, in France, and in parts of Scandinavia. And in America, you have Donald Trump. And what all of these far-right parties have in common is a hatred and a vitriol of asylum seekers and refugees. I have always argued all my political life that talking about refugees and asylum seekers is a euphemism for talking about people of colour. When people talk about refugees and asylum seekers, talking about the other. And let's not make any mistake about it. So with Donald Trump, the first time Donald Trump got elected, his base was very much white working class Americans, and it was very much a backlash against Obama. Now, he's modified it a bit, but fundamentally you're talking about race and you're talking about white racism. So we are kind of poised in a very difficult time. And of course, at the heart of all this is the thinking and the arguing and the work and the writing of Black women. Absolutely Black women. So I think it's an important time to be talking about black women in leadership, partly because of what's happening internationally, and partly because we need to look to the future. We have never needed black women's leadership more.
Exactly.
And I feel so honoured to be on the platform with all of you.
Yes, for sure.
So thinking about these times that we're in, and I think all of you have sort of outlined how tragic recent years have been and the position that we've come to and what black women's leadership means to that. So when I think of black women's leadership, it's very interesting. I think everybody here in the audience might have a different understanding of what that means. So for some, it will be those who are very prominent, within the political system at high levels, such as our own Diane Abbott MP here, or Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, the first woman head of state on the African continent, or Mia Mottley, who I think many of us will be quite familiar with now, the Prime Minister of Barbados, very vocal, very much in the public eye and very contentious with it. Or it could be those who have come to prominence by challenging the system, right? Those who are disrupting the system. Some may be trying to dismantle the system. And here I'm thinking about Wangari Maathai, the first Nobel Peace Laureate, again from the African continent, who challenged corporates and the government itself from her eco-feminist perspective. And then there are others who we all know in our communities, those who are in our streets, in our fields, on our farms. And these could be the women the many women who have been at the forefront, for example, of movements to challenge, police oppression. Here in the UK, when somebody from the community dies within police custody, you will find women at the forefront of those movements. Or it could be women who are at the forefront, on the front lines, literally on the coalface of resource extraction in the Congo, fighting for their ancestral lands. And thinking of that multiplicity of what black women's leadership is, the one thing that strikes me is that even within all of that, and of course women can move beyond those different markers, and there are many as well within that. But even though we are not a monolith, there is a clear juxtapositioning between where we are and where power and decision-making is often concentrated and where it's expected to be. And that is very simply white, male, and largely middle class. So thinking about what black women's leadership is and what it can do to change. If I can first of all come to you again, Jessica, and thinking about what black women's leadership means to challenging injustice. What examples, you've put quite a few in that book. I mean, that book is a compendium, actually, of African feminist praxis going back generations. What kind of examples can we think of that really demonstrate the transformational agency that black women bring with them when they step into leadership positions, no matter where they are within this stratification?
Thank you for the question. I mean, there's one of the things you realize is that we're so underdocumented that every time we have this conversation, we have to start almost like explaining the broad terrain because it's not familiar enough. We almost don't even have the capacity yet to just say one thing and everybody knows what we mean. And that, to me, is an indication, actually, of how we've been so marginalized at the same time as being so central. In the book, I talk a lot, I wanted to document contemporary praxis of African feminists, but I ended up needing to go back in history. And what you realize is that the African liberation movements, women were actually central to them. And again, not just in administrative or support roles, but actually central to the thinking, central to a lot of the strategy, the tactical work. Some were even literally on the armed front line. And I think what's very interesting when you look at this kind of progressive African politics, women's politics, and I think it extends across the Afro-descendant and the world of black women. In progressive politics, there are a few things. One is that it's always relational. We have an understanding that nothing is changed without all of us. And so I think all of the examples that I look at, people are doing it together. There's a very strong sense of collectivism. And I think that that's one thing we really need to remember, because we're in a social media world where everything is celebrity, and celebrity is individual, right? There's no collective celebrity, right? Celebrity is individual, but it's actually a misnomer. Nothing happens without a movement. Nothing happens without other people. I think the other thing is that whatever we do, we're deeply aesthetic. And because we're so aesthetic, it's actually one of the things that's very misunderstood in leadership. And you often notice that one of the ways that Black women leaders are attacked is in the aesthetic domain. We are deeply aesthetic. And one of the superpowers that brings is that we have the ability to shape culture, right? Because we implicitly engage in the production of culture constantly. And that is powerful, yeah? And the last thing I would say is just actually censoring care. And I know for younger generations, care has become a big thing, but it's actually very important. And I look at care, actually I argue that one of the foundational movements in dealing with collective care is actually the movement of women living with HIV. Because on the African continent, it was a situation where people were so disenfranchised in the global pharmaceutical markets, right? That there was this big interest to deal with the booming market of ARVs, no interest at all to produce generic antiretrovirals, which meant that many African women did not have access. And for a long time, it was just a situation of death. And people were trying to deal with this extreme situation of a health crisis more or less alone. And so people developed incredible ways of looking after each other in community that were accessible, that were affordable, and that dealt with all dimensions of the self, including the spirit. So we have these things that we bring. And like I said, I actually think for the crises of now, it's exactly what we need. This is exactly the approach that we need, that it's collective and relational, that it centers care, and that it's deeply aesthetic.
Yeah. So you touched briefly on sort of the issue of women not being written in to history. Somebody who came late and missed the, the housekeeping, and basically this issue of invisibility or the invisibilization of Black women leaders is something that we see as a historical process. And so if I can ask you, Carole, because in your book you address this, and I know you've also addressed it in your book as well. And let's just talk about, I suppose, a little bit about what that invisibility can look like, because it's something that we experience on a day-to-day basis, and then it's something that Black women leaders, including very prominent ones, very instrumental ones to movements, can also experience. So in our everyday, I think almost every woman, this is not about race in some ways, is aware of being in that meeting where you came up with the idea, and then a few minutes later it was regurgitated by a man next to you. And now all of a sudden it's the idea that everybody's gonna go with, and everybody's completely forgotten that you mentioned it at the beginning of the meeting, right? So that's how we all experience it on an everyday level. But then of course we know that, history has played an unbelievable, or the way in which history is captured has played an unbelievable role in invisibilizing women and their contributions to everything that, this planet and our societies have created. But Black women's invisibilization is something else altogether, because we sit at that intersection of race and gender. And so, Carole, to ask you, your canon of work has included highlighting all of this, sort of the when, the how. If you're able to speak a little bit to that, would be great in terms of the historical, so that we can get an idea of what that has looked like where Black women are concerned in particular, but then also where you think we are today with that issue.
But, and I want to start with Toni Morrison, who shifted that question completely and said instead, invisible to whom? We see ourselves, we know our communities, and we know who that leadership is. Does the larger society see us, see them? Often they do, but it's a deliberate way of removing them from that sort of public presence, unless it's something negative, perhaps. So we want to say we are visible in our communities, and we know who our leaders are in those communities, and a lot of the times they are Black women. In fact, what the research shows is that much of the work that happens in terms of moving society forward operates at the local level. And this is where often Black women function in community groups, in churches, in organizations, in schools, in just being part of communities. For example, I grew up in a family where my aunt, and I don't know how she did it in Barataria, Trinidad and Tobago, created something called a breakfast shed where she would feed children in the neighborhood for lunch every day, free out of her own resources. And I still try to figure out, how did she do that? Where did she get the money from? And we learn it's a lot of times community resources, people give her this, that, and so on. And we have many other examples of that same thing throughout the world. So the logic of leadership is often that sort of charismatic male who stands up and gives a big speech and so on, and that's what is pushed forward. But the ground level leadership that Black women do consistently is not invisible to us, and we now have to recognize it. And this is what some of the scholarship is doing, is saying, well, what about this person? What about that person? And this is what I was saying earlier, that we should have no competition about doing work. We should find all of those women and make sure that we have biographies, feminist biographies, that capture what they have done in our societies and our communities. So the model I have of Claudia Jones in working here in this community, but also before that working in the United States to do all kinds of other collective organizational work, is one that we want to keep bringing forward and make sure that we are able to have our scholars and our young people think about the levels of leadership that we have. And they still exist today. We have multiple examples that we can document and identify throughout our communities. And I just want us to be conscious of that ongoing. And then to say the whole question of the contemporary, where people have this concern about that many Black girls going to school as opposed to Black boys. And I keep saying, if Black women are getting educated at a level higher than the young men, are they going to accept leadership from men who are often not as informed? So basically, when we look at current leadership, we can see, using current examples, right? In the United States, for sure, that it does not have to be intelligence. I mean, who makes those kinds of decisions to just wake up in the morning and decide, I'm going to tariff this one, tariff that one, and then see what happens, right? It's a pathway to a certain kind of destruction and a level of lack of economic knowledge that is displayed for the world to see. But this person is a leader, right? So essentially, we have to say, who are these people leading? What kind of knowledge do they have? And what makes us then, who are operating from a sense of not being seen, have an opportunity to challenge and transform that whole process. And this is why we recognize the leadership at the national political level or the international political level, as opposed to what's going on in our streets and our communities and so on. How to bring those together, I think, is the question. And often we see great examples, the Mia Motleys and so on. But they struggle as well with trying to really navigate their communities and make sure that they're visible and seen and so on. And when we do, it's very powerful. So Black women's leadership, if it's progressive, if it's transformative, is definitely going to be pushing society forward. Another example from Claudia Jones, when Black women move, when Black women lead, everybody moves because we are considered to be at the bottom of that pyramid. So once we move, the whole society is also moving. Mm-hmm. And you see so many examples of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And you make the point that you make about, sort of the concerns in certain parts of the world that girls are being educated at a higher rate than boys. I know that there's, as an educationalist, I worked in the educational field for quite a long time, and I've conducted research actually on this issue of perceived boys' underachievement, etc. But the point that you make is so interesting because it kind of brings me back to this issue we have of having to be twice as brilliant, right? And when we talk about this within the race, context, I think is something that everybody understands. Most of us have had that conversation. You can't fail because if you fail, you will be seen to fail harder. From your parents, they'll give you that warning. You've got to work twice as hard to get the same job, etc. And then thinking about Black women as they walk into and sit and take up space in places of power where Black women's bodies, are often not present. So, you are often a singular individual at the start of your career, at least, often not welcomed, and in some cases, even actually unsafe within. But you still have to walk into those spaces. And here I turn to you, Diane, as somebody who has spent her life and her career walking into spaces of power. And just to get a sense of kind of, what your thoughts are around this issue of not so much invisibility, but visibility, the importance of visibility. Is there a need for hypervisibility as a Black woman leader? What does it allow you to achieve? But what are the dangers that potentially could come with it? And so just some thoughts on the question of visibility as a Black woman leader in the UK context or even more broadly.
Let me just say a few words about leadership, because you've spoken about leadership at a national level and so on and so forth. My mother came to this country in the 1950s from rural Jamaica. She came live and direct from rural Jamaica to London. And that generation of West Indian women showed tremendous leadership. They didn't get the profile of the men and so on and so forth, but they kept communities together and they encouraged their children to reach up. My mother left school in rural Jamaica at the age of 14. And she lived to see her daughter, a British Member of Parliament. So when I talk about leadership, I think it's important to remember Black women who are not, great writers and politicians, whatever, but play such an important role in holding communities together and keeping their children's eyes on the prize. On the question of visibility and invisibility, I was elected to the British Parliament in 1987. And then for the next 10 years, I was the only Black woman in the British Parliament. And in some ways, you were completely invisible. I wanted to talk about issues, from policy, education, but you would say these things and people weren't hearing because you were invisible. But on the other hand, you were highly visible. Even if you so much as, drank a soft drink on the... right.
Got a bit of coffee.
That was a big story. So what you wanted to talk about, you're invisible, but you're there with your, Marks and Spencer pina colada.
Oh, wow.
And it's a front page story. So this kind of thing about being visible and invisible, and it's, I suppose, you have to fight your way through the invisibility to be able to try and put the things on the political agenda, to be able to make people pay attention to the things that you want them to pay attention to. I'm now, after 37 years in Parliament, the mother of the house. I had no idea I was going to be the mother of the house. I hadn't thought about it at all. And it was another woman MP, Harriet Harman, some of you may have heard of. She rang me a few weeks before the general election to say, you're going to be mother of the house. I said, really? I haven't thought about it. She said, oh, yes. And she went through what I had to do. But in a way, as a Black woman, to be mother of the house, although it means nothing in a way, is remarkable. It's remarkable. So yeah, you can be visible, you can be invisible, but I would say you have to stick with it. You have to stick with it. Because things I've been talking about for 30-odd years, people are talking about now, whether it's what happens to our children in school, whether it's what happens to Black women in the professions. So what am I saying? You'll be visible, you'll be invisible, but you need to keep your eyes on the prize.
And I think when we think about that keeping with it, the thing that comes to my mind again is the issue of backlash and how we deal with that. And you know, so your book outlines how things have changed a lot. I think it was 6% representation globally at the beginning of the century, and now we're on
23, 22.
22, 23. So, you know, definitely nowhere near parity yet. Although there's a whole conversation about what parity actually means, if it means anything, depending on, you know, sort of the politics that are also involved. So there has been clear movement. And then we look at where we are now in 2025 with some of the most regressive rollbacks in women's rights, generally, that I think any of us have seen in our lifetimes.
Yeah.
And is there a correlation between increased Black women's leadership, you know, in public spaces, or that's clearer to see, and a rise in backlash? So I suppose that's the first question. That's for anyone who really wants to answer that. And what are our strategies for addressing that? You know, how do we work together to combat what is existing, but what could potentially get worse as time goes by? And I'm thinking about, you know, many of, like today, we have, you know, quite a few Black women MPs in Parliament, and it's amazing. So, you know, I'm in a situation, I've got a Black woman MP, and it was the best thing that happened in the 2019 elections. I woke up the next day and I thought, oh my God, there's still something to be happy about. Belle Ribeiro Addy is my MP, and it was like fantastic, great. There is still hope. And so that progressive sort of optimism was embedded in the reality of not just a Black woman MP in my constituency, but one with very progressive politics as well. But with that also comes backlash, you know, as we have seen. So again, you know, is there a correlation, and how do we deal with this as a strategy?
Yeah, the first thing I would say, though, is that we cannot assume, and we've learned the lesson starkly, right, from the rise of Black men and Black women in leadership. We cannot assume that the person's identity, racial or gender identity, is automatically going to translate into progressive politics. And I've seen painful lessons of that. The U.S. Supreme Court is a good example with Clarence Thomas, right? And the sad part of that is that they often acquire a certain kind of power, but how to do a lot of damage. So we've learned, I think, in the last cycle of seeing people come to power, that we cannot assume that because that person is a Black man or woman or white woman, that they're going to really be representing or have trustworthy politics that we can depend on to really represent. So based on that, clarifying that really well now, we then have to look at what kinds of politics we see coming through certain kinds of representations, and I think that's the first step. And it's a bit disheartening, right? Because the assumption was that we will, once we got to a certain level of representation, things would really advance themselves. The next part of it, though, is that sometimes the violence against Black women in leadership is not just political, it's sometimes personal, it's sometimes aggressively directed at individuals for their statements or work. And I mean, the case of Jasmine Crockett in the United States is a good example. I don't know how much you follow of that there, where she's probably one of the youngest and most articulate of the young women talking, but still has to consistently put herself out there so that she's challenging all those negative representations that come her way. And there are several other examples that we can point at as well. And then, of course, I'm sure you've seen in some of the African countries really physically, women being physically attacked as well. So we have to assume that the backlashes are not just personal or aggressively media campaigns and so on, but sometimes very dangerous. But we do have to still keep going and protect ourselves as much as we can from those horrible representations, from what a colleague calls keep your place, stay in your place aggression, or keep your place aggression that comes from certain people as we move through, whether it's in our work situations, educational situations, and so on. So I think we learned from our ancestors, our family, and the examples that Diane gave earlier as well, that those women did not give up in spite of it all. And we have to take those examples forward, that we still move forward, we still do what we have to do, we still protect ourselves, we think ahead, we anticipate, we protect ourselves from danger, and we respond. We should not be silent in the face of offensive, aggressive politics.
Yeah. And Jessica, in your book, you know, you've broken your book down into these chapters as a way of framing African feminist praxis. And I think within that, you know, the two chapters that sort of really jumped out at me around this issue of how to tackle some of, you know, this backlash. And you know, let's be clear, it's not something that's new.
No,
it's constant. It is as old as we have been trying to fight the patriarchy, so centuries, essentially. But, you know, there are two chapters, kinship and care, which really sort of jumped out at me. And so thinking again about how, you know, African feminist praxis embodies those two broad framings and what that means for dealing with, including some of these personal instances of violence that can come on the back of stepping into leadership positions, again, at any level, right down from the community level to the highest national levels.
Yeah, I mean, as I was saying earlier, I think one of the interesting things about, you'd find it actually in all Black progressive politics is it's really relational. So there's different concepts. So a lot of people hear about the concept of Ubuntu in African American discourses, beloved community. I mean, we're really about us, you know? We're really about us. And that's actually one of the ways to engage this question of backlash, because again, the attack is often on individuals because they're the figureheads, symbolic, basically, of a shift in power. You know, backlash, we must remember, is an index that we're doing something right. Mm-hmm. You know, you have to remember that, because people wouldn't want to shut you up if what you're saying is not making a difference. So if people are trying to shut you up, it's because what you're saying actually has power in it. So the relational dimension is critical. And I think that grounding our work in an understanding of the kinship between us, but also in a really like radically inclusive way. You know, so the capacity to look at all of us in community and say we all have a right to belong. And then also we all have to do the work to work out our own discrimination. So we're also able to encounter the other and say, of course we're together, we're also welcome. I'll work on me, you work on you, and we'll find a way to be together, even though we're different. And that goes for all of the intersections of disability, of sexual orientation, gender identity, all of the things. We just constantly have to work on a way to figure out how to be together. But that desire to find a way, right? It's very often, in feminism, it's very often called sisterhood. People have expanded it to siblinghood. It's about relational, finding a way to be together. To me, that's the anchor. And if we can really sort that out, it is basically a counter to that what authoritarians do, which is to rely on the subjugation of the other. If we don't let them, it diminishes their power. If we allow, right, ourselves to follow along with the anti-migrant, with the racist, with the whatever, we're giving authoritarians power, because what we're doing is legitimizing the idea that it's possible to demonize another. So we understand each other as kin, and then we treat each other as kin. If someone is your kin, you look after them, you make sure they have water and food, am I right? Yeah? You make sure that they're safe. If they have, they get sick, you bring them, right? Ginger tea and soup, right? That's your kin. So we see each other as kin, which then means that care will always be a part, right? And so we always look after each other as kin. These are very simple concepts, but I think it's what underlies, you know, all of what we're talking about of Black women in community and what they do. You know, they have an understanding, yeah, that it's about us. And so they have this capacity to nurture and ensure that community can thrive, even in these small ways of making sure children can eat, you know, or making sure that their children are educated, all the way to the point of community protection, which a lot of Black women do, and again is less noted in the archive, because it doesn't always come with a glamorous look, the beret and the whatever, right? But it's community protection, making sure that people are safe, sometimes even hiding people, right? Standing up when people are being attacked, right?
Defending. Definitely.
Is a part of that, but that's what you do for kin. So again, how do we keep deepening our understanding of every human being is your kin? And so we find a way to acknowledge that, but also find a way to build in this radical care to protect each other as we engage with these forces that seek to destroy us, because our presence basically offers too much beauty and too much humanity and too much panache. Huh? Yes, too much fabulous. Yes, that is what we're offering. And they can't manage. So, yeah.
Oh, wow, too much fabulous.
So, you know, the chapters that, you know, you wrote on kinship and care really spoke to the heart. And in fact, the whole book does speak to the issue of solidarity in many ways, but those did. And solidarity comes in many ways. So actually, Diane, when you mentioned the incident with the pseudo soft drink, shall we call it that, from Marks and Spencer's, I remember when that hit the news, the first thing I did was ran out and buy that and drank it everywhere in public, because I couldn't, you know, it was utter nonsense, you know, that was being used here. And so this question of solidarity and what solidarity can look like. In your book, one of the things that the chapters that I loved the most was the one where you documented sort of your gradual radicalization in the 70s, and visiting sort of, you know, black women, feminist movements. I think you mentioned one that you actually came to Brixton, which is where I grew up, and, you know, thinking about, you know, how important those movements were, but which again, you know, not many of us are perhaps as familiar with today. Olive Morris, who many of you might be familiar with, you know, a Brixtonian trade union activist, feminist activist. Unfortunately, you know, we lost her at a young age. I was just a couple of years old when she passed. And today, you know, there was a whole building, Olive Morris House in Lambeth, which is where everyone went and sorted out their council tax and everything else. And now that's been replaced by a block of flats. And you have to look for, you know, sort of a memorial to her. There is one, you know, where she had lived and stuff like that. But thinking about, you know, those times and the idea of solidarity politics, I'd like to ask, what does solidarity politics, what has it meant throughout your career, in whatever form? So, you know, whether it's at the grassroots form or even within the house itself, and how has it manifested, and how critical has it been to you as a black woman leader?
Well, first of all, I would just say a few sentences about Belvira Addy, who is your MP, down in Lambeth, but she worked for me for 10 years.
Oh, wow.
And she's a great MP, and she's got decades of being a fantastic MP ahead of her. And I've always felt, which is perhaps naive, that in whatever position I find myself, I worked in the media before I became an MP, and other staff, and certainly as an MP, I have to help other people come forward. And I'm slightly puzzled that there are so many black MPs who don't employ black staff. I sometimes have the odd white man in there, right? You know, there have to be white men that are happy to work with a group of black women, hey? But my office is always run by a black woman, and I really can't understand black politicians do anything different. The other thing I was going to say, though, was a little bit what Carole was touching on, the issue of representation. Representation is important. When I first became an MP, remember, 650 MPs, and there were 41 women. 41 women. Now, there are 190 women, which still isn't enough, but it does represent progress. And I believe in representation, but representation isn't everything.
It's not.
I believe in representation, but just because you represent your political, religious, or ethnic group doesn't mean you're going to step up. It's just what it is. So I wouldn't say it's not important to have more, top writers and so on, and MPs and so on. But I would say it isn't enough. And the other thing I would say is about the backlash. I mean, 37 years in Parliament, 37 years of backlash,
Wow.
Year in, year out. And yet, I think it's important not to feel too sorry for yourself. I've got a friend, a very good friend, she's a white woman, in fact, Annie. And Annie always says that, and she's not an MP at all, she's just an activist. But Annie always says if you're working class and you become an MP, it's the job your parents always wanted for you. Clean, indoor work and no heavy lifting. And I do think we have to remember, I mean, it's there's a backlash, there's a struggle, there's the difficulty, there's the challenges that your children face and so on. But we do have to remember, and certainly I remember it, how much better placed you are than your parents. So one of the things I've tried to do is not feel too sorry for myself because, hey, my mum was a nurse. There's a whole generation of West Indian women that were nurses.
Exactly.
Women my age, their mothers were all nurses. And it's tough being a black woman MP, but it was tougher being a black nurse in the 70s. So, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
It's true.
So before we go to Q&A, I just wanted to ask each of you to sort of give us a bit of an idea of what kinds of strategies do you think we should be using to nourish ourselves? And I use kind of the collective here, quite broadly, thinking again of black women leaders as you mentioned, being more than just those who we see in the public eye. Many of you in this audience today, I'm sure, are black women leaders in your communities and your movements, even within your organizations. As black women, we're always sort of in spaces where we're having to pull together some kind of understanding of what the issues are from a race perspective. And that work is often dumped on us, in the UK context especially. But even, sort of more internationally, obviously in the diaspora, you've got that similarity. But even on the African continent, you've got women constantly in organizational spaces having to push the gender agenda forward, having to take on that extra work. So thinking about what we do in order to nourish ourselves. So coming back a little bit to the question of care, but what kinds of strategies do we pull together? We've talked about solidarity, collectivism that you've mentioned. Any final thoughts on how we move forward for this? Because there is a lot of hope and optimism, sort of that long-term optimistic view that allows you to wake up in the morning and get on with it anyway, despite the fact that today might be another really difficult day. So I'll just leave that open to whoever wants to start first to close us off. Just a few thoughts on how we sort of strategize for nourishing and fulfillment and sustaining that getting on with it anyway, that sustaining of leadership.
Yeah. Well, I go back to an interview I had with Ellen Johnson Sirleaf in which she said we need a network where we can understand what kinds of strategies people have used in different locations. And the reason why I say that is, for example, Kamala in the US, Kamala, who was running for president of the US, I would imagine needed also to engage what women in other locations have done. How did Portia Simpson Miller do it? How did Diane Abbott do it? In other words, I don't think we should keep our vision always local, so the strategies have to be global. We have to look at the examples people have given before. And I remember reading about the influence of Shirley Chisholm's example on Diane. And Shirley Chisholm was amazing because she was the first woman in there as a congresswoman with the men challenging her all the time, not sitting by her in the lunch table where normally people strategize and so on. And just really having to tell them, move out of my way if you can't really help me. And so she was a good example to many of the other women who came after her. So I'm just saying that we need to look at strategies from different locations. What are women in Brazil doing? What are women in different African countries doing that are useful that we can learn from, so that we have a larger understanding of ourselves globally and therefore can see how we can impact different local situations. That's the first thought, but I have others.
Okay. Jessica?
Yeah, I love that. I was actually going to say read. Read.
Read, go ahead.
Read, because, you know, this moment, we're in a situation where we're just being bombarded, you know, so it's sort of like every 5 minutes there's a new bizarre policy or a new strange statement, and we're just being bombarded. But actually, I think it's the perfect time to slow down, change the pace. You have the power to do that. Change the pace. And I think it's really time to read in the broadest sense of study again. Like, you know, what has happened in history? How have we been organized before? How have people done things? Because strategy really is about understanding patterns. And the patterns come from history. So I think we need to actually dig back in and read
And
more.
see how people
absolutely.
challenged,
Remember that we're all connected. So again, we cannot do, it's a time for internationalism, you know, it's really a time for internationalism and to reconnect with other parts of the world. If you're sitting in the UK, or people to really think, like, because I said, it's a multipolar world now. What's happening? How much do you even know about the histories of some of these countries which are going to shape, actually, a lot of our political economy? It's time to really engage that and learn. And then in terms of just nourishing, I mean, I think we have now more tools and language at our disposal. On the question of care, there's a lot more resources. But what I would say, though, is as we're organizing ourselves, and I would say there's a healer sitting there, but I would just say it is a time to acknowledge that there are people with particular skill at care. There are healers who are actually healers with a technical skill, okay, and spiritual insight. And those are the people that can actually help guide us. So I actually think we need to turn a little bit more to hear from healers about what their guidance is. I just say that as somebody from an institutional perspective who's actually supported a lot of care practice. And I think one of the things we haven't done well is actually ensure that we center leaders, healers, in shaping how we define how we offer care, like an institutional vantage point. So I think leaning into the healers, acknowledging that healers have always been present in our movements, and allowing them to help guide, to build the spaces, and help inform our understandings of how we can do that in a deeper way.
Thank you. Yeah. And finally, Diane, any final thoughts on this one?
First of all, self-care, that's a really important concept. And one thing I've realised relatively late in life is I haven't spent enough time giving myself self-care. If you're a black woman, you're always caring for other people, your children, if you're in politics, you know, the people you represent. And belatedly, I've come to realise the importance of self-care. In practice, I've relied on other black women to give me support and care. And they're women that, you know, are political with a small p, but they're not necessarily party politicians. And sometimes, as a professional politician, you need to talk to people who say, what type of fuckery is this? What's the matter with you, Diane?
Right.
What is the matter with you?
Absolutely.
And the final thing I'd say is this. I don't know, 10, 20 years ago, there was some awful media stuff, and there's just been a series of awful media stuff, unfair, dishonest, blah, blah, blah. And I decided I had enough of this. I'm stepping down from politics. And I rang a man, in fact, I spoke to a man who was one of the men that got elected at the same time as me in '87. And I went on and on about it was all awful and I was going to stand down. And he said to me, I've never forgotten, he said to me, Diane, you can't stand down. You have forgotten what it took to get here. So personal friendship, personal support, but also keeping in your mind somehow why you're doing what you're doing. You just can't walk away, however hard it is.
Okay. So on that note, we now come to our Q&A. So I'm hoping you've all been thinking with some great questions. Right, oh great, the lights, I can see everybody much better now because my contact lenses really need upgrading. I was worried I wouldn't be able to see you. So this is great. So we'll take, try and get a couple of rounds of questions in. We'll start off, do we have questions online, Jonah? Yeah, okay. So we'll take a couple from the audience and then one online, and then we'll allow you all to answer, and then we'll do another round after that. So, first hand straight up there, and then a second alongside.
Thank you so much. This has been such an illuminating and energizing conversation. And I was just thinking about the title and some of the things that you've all been saying, and about when Black women lead. And I kept thinking about the two women sitting next to me. One here is the first woman of the Ghanaian Stock Exchange, the first CEO, Abina Amo. And also Tokumo Ishmael, who is the first woman in Africa to lead a gender lens fund, $100 million, to really think about investing in women. And in relation to what you women were saying about the importance of documenting and really thinking about history, and to ask each and every one of you, how do you think women like this and other women in the audience and who are looking, how should they really be thinking about documenting their own experience so that other people can see how important it is? Because often people are in the process of doing every day and charting the path, but without thinking of stepping back to document their process. And this is why I think both your books are just, I recommend everyone to buy each and every one of these books. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And then I think the hand was, yes, not too far away over here. Oh, there's somebody just to your left, yeah.
If I could respond to that, dude, I think the person is Bibi Bakari Yusuf, right? So she indicated, and I love that, the women around her who were doing a lot of leadership. But she herself is a publisher, because I have a press. So we want to represent you as well in this kind of context, because you provide an avenue for women to do just what you asked, document. I think we all have to be doing it and make sure that we keep our own records. My mother used to write on the yellow papers, handwriting, things that she did every day and so on. And I actually, I was in one of my books, I used a portion of it because she actually documented certain aspects of her life that I did not know about. So we have to think of our own personal record. Don't put it on X anymore. Those platforms, please, because I mean you can tell how those platforms have been abusive to us. But make sure you keep your own records of your own life. And I'm happy that, Diane, your book is available, and the other one that I referenced in my book. So I'm definitely going to get a copy of that as well. So make sure you document. Make sure you recommend other people around you to do the same, and make sure we keep a narrative going. We need many. We have so much so many of these examples, and so much to do and talk about. So this is why I said earlier, we cannot assume that because there's one book, that's it. There should be many more, and we want to really make sure that we keep the narrative going.
Absolutely. Great.
Hey, I echo the lady's comments behind me in terms of insightful and very engaging conversation. I guess what was running through my head when I listened to the conversation we're having now about Black women leading, and you hear similar conversations in other spaces with white women talking about leadership. The difference is they talk about allyship and support from their fellow white men, their brothers, their fathers, their cousins who are occupying these seats of power. What are our expectations of the Black men when it comes to allyship? given that particularly in the West, we may out-educate and out-earn them. Can you speak to the men who have acted as allies to you as you've risen and occupied those seats of power? And my second little question, if I may, is to Jessica. You said something earlier, and I'm paraphrasing here, so forgive me, that backlash means that that you're doing something good. When Kemi Badenoch when she rose to her position, the backlash was not backlashing in a positive manner. So is she doing some good? Is she doing something good, or have we got it wrong there?
I didn't quite understand.
I'm asking.
I'm going to take just one more question. The question we knew would come.
I have no idea, so I'm going to stay on it.
Okay. So we'll take one question from online, and then we'll allow you all to answer.
British Candace Owens.
So this online question. There's been a range of black US women on social media making it clear that they are no longer going to be the ones on the front line, that white people and some black men are going to have to fight without them. What do you think will be the consequence of this?
Okay. All right. So
Stepping out.
I will allow you all to answer which ones you see fit. So please, whoever wants to start first, go ahead. And then we'll try and take one more round of about the same number of questions.
Let me say something about Kemi. Because I'm in the same building as Kemi 4 or 5 days a week. I don't want to say anything bad about Kemi. But the way the British Parliament is laid out, you're facing each other. It's not like, I think some parliaments are like circular, semicircular. We face each other. And because I'm mother of the house, I get to sit on the front bench. And so I can see Kemi saying what she says, doing what she does. And I can see all the white male Tory MPs behind her. And I think if Kemi were ever to look behind her and see their faces, she might not be quite so confident in the act that she's acting out.
Wow. Hashtag that is all.
I know.
Drop.
Yes. Documenting, I think, is also partly about creating an infrastructure of documentation. So one of the things we both don't have the time and space because we're doing 3 times the labor in the same role. There's no time and space to document sometimes, although I do think you're right in terms of it's important to. But what we need is an infrastructure around it. We need more filmmaking, more editorial writing, more, right? I mean, people need to be engaging the labor of really interesting, right, transformative black women and documenting it. I think it shouldn't always be having to self-document because that implies that, again, nobody else is actually interested in investing in it. It's not, you know what I mean? It's nobody else is interested to invest in the labor. We have, in real global terms, a minimal percentage of infrastructure dedicated to our lives. And so I think that needs to change. And yes, it is Bibi Bakari Yusuf who, of course, offered us the concept of building an archival future. And I think that has to be done by resourcing it. So I would say for anybody who's interested in the idea of supporting black women's transformative leadership, I would say, and then resource the infrastructure to enable it. Because it's not just about individuals, it's actually about an infrastructure that's required to actually help support it. And that's the piece that always gets dropped. And of course, any initiative that's there I've worked in funding for 2 decades, I know very well, any infrastructure that's there is temporal. You know what I mean? And it's somehow a special interest issue, and then when, budgets get tight, boom, you're dropped. And that's insufficient. We need to resource the infrastructure if we're interested in supporting the leadership. In terms of black women are just doing their nails right now, and they're just, don't call me, I'll call you. Voting patterns suggest otherwise, and so I think it's just more an exasperated threat.
Exactly.
But actually, if you look at electoral politics, you see that black women are actually on a front line of trying to create a different world. And I don't think that will change, but I think what people are saying is, again, there's only so far you can offer your labor with absolutely no recognition, and also being gaslighted, sidelined, silenced constantly, and then having to sit there and say, hey, we told you so. So, I mean, I do think that's the reason for panels like this, is just to say, look, there is an insight, and that insight comes actually from being the bottom of the historical pile and knowing very well what it feels like to face multiple oppressions, right? And so know very well what bad policy looks like, know very well, right, what bad infrastructure looks like, and we're telling you, from our vantage point, that's not the way to go. This is the thing that's going to get all of us free. So I do think it's all of us have to make that shift in understanding and deeper appreciation, actually, for what the vantage point brings.
Just a quick word about black women and politics. Kamala Harris lost to Donald Trump, and with every day that goes past, you wonder how people could have voted for Donald Trump rather than Kamala Harris. But I think it's worth reminding ourselves that Kamala Harris lost a lot of Hispanic votes. She lost a certain amount of black male votes, but black women, 95% of black women voted for Kamala, which I think shows a superior political understanding of black women.
This is true. This is true. Yeah, I think on that question that Jonah, you gave, I think periodically women do feel we need to step back and take care of ourselves and self-care before we re-engage. So I think that's the spirit of that question for me, because it's impossible to fully withdraw from any kind of activism. The struggle continues, we know. So I think it's a strategic move at a certain point in any kind of activism to say, what about me? How do I, retool myself for going further?
Okay, let's take one last round. So we've got one hand there, one hand here. Oh, we've got so many. I don't think we have enough time for all of this. Let's take the first two that I pointed out, and then another one from online. So, yeah.
Hello, hi, again, thank you. As everyone's already said, it's been amazing so far. Mine is a really selfish question, so I'm going to take the opportunity to ask for some advice from you on the stage. And mine is about getting my power back. I think I'm going through a period of feeling quite powerless, which I think as female leaders we can often feel, and I'm a member of leadership in my organisation. I'm a global director for social impact, and I was a teenage parent from Camden, I was homeless in Camden, I lived in hostels in Camden, and I have a son doing aeronautical engineering who went to private school on scholarship. I worked my way up from volunteering locally in Somerstown to the role I have today, and the last year I took a bit of a knock. And for those of you in the UK, you'll have heard of the young lady who lost her life at Notting Hill Carnival, who was incredibly close to me. So I've spent the last 3 weeks in the well of the court at the Old Bailey. And from going from a position of feeling like I can make a difference to watching someone close to me lose their life, to watching 3 young black men defend their lives, to watching mothers, to being in the same courtroom as the young girl in Croydon who lost her life, and just turning on the news and it's sad, and just feeling like, what difference can I make? So I'm feeling a bit of a knock in my power. I'm feeling a little bit broken, if I'm honest. And maybe from speaking to other female leaders, sort of when you take a bit of a knock, how do I get some of that power back? How do I start to feel like I can be powerful again?
Thank you. Thank you very much for that. Yes, the other...
Me. Hi, it's me. Okay, so somebody sort of partially asked the question earlier, but when you were all talking about everything that you've been through and all the developments going on in the world, fantastic things happening, I was thinking about Malcolm X saying that the black woman is the most disrespected person in America, and also then he said, and the most unprotected person in America. So how much, since Malcolm X made that comment way back when, how much do you think things have changed, and what can we do to stop that from being the status quo? I mean, somebody said it's time for black men to step up, from allyship for other people to step up. So I'd like to know what strategies do you think should be in place for this to not be the status quo? Because I still believe that the black woman is the most disrespected person in America and the most unprotected, in fact, globally. So how do we change this? A big question, I know, I apologize, sorry, but I want to know. Thank you.
Thank you. And should we take another one online? After this one, let me ask you, Jonah, do we have time for a couple more? We started a bit late, so yeah, fantastic, great. Let's take one online and then we'll come back to the audience.
Great. This one's from DJ. It's a question for Carole. I know there are many brilliant Caribbean women globally, people like Shirley Chisholm, Claudia Jones, Mia Motley et al. But who are some of the lesser-known Caribbean women, or one woman who has gone under the radar and made significant contributions to the advancement of black women?
I have to think about that one. Because if they went under the radar, that means we haven't had a lot of scholarship on them. I do have one. The mother of Malcolm X. And I wanted to link it back to what you were saying. There's a new book by Merle Collins called Ocean Stirrings. I want to recommend it because she went into that whole, if you look at the autobiography of Malcolm X, that introductory chapter does talk about his mother, who comes from Grenada.
Of course.
And migrates to Montreal and is very much involved in the UNIA, the Garvey movement. And so actually Malcolm X gets his knowledge of Pan-Africanism not only from his father, but definitely from his mother. So if we want to talk about unrecognized woman, that's one right there. So look at Louise Langdon Little, the mother of Malcolm X. So Malcolm X's point about the black woman being the most disrespected is coming from witnessing his mother, who after the father is killed in a horrible accident, they say, but probably by Klan assassination, it seems. She had to take care of 7 children by herself and ended up being put in a mental institution for 24 years. So in my estimation, the tragedy of Malcolm X is not just the fact that he rose to such glory and then was assassinated, but that his mother had that experience, and he witnessed it. She was also abused by the father. He talks about the abuse, and it comes back around again. So linking it to that question, Juna, yes, Louise Langdon Little, the mother of Malcolm X, read up about her. There's another scholar in the US named Eric McDuffie, who has done a lot of research on her, and his book came out recently as well, Eric McDuffie's book on the mother of Malcolm X. And the reason why, and link back to Bibi's question, and the other question about documenting, the reason why that is significant is that the paradigm we've always worked with is that we study and document men's lives, but the narratives and autobiographies of women tend to disappear from recognition. So our process has to always be to find avenues to do it. And what Merle Collins does, she does it through archival research. She goes into the family archives, and then she also does it imaginatively in the end, using poetry in the period when she was institutionalized, to see what could she have been thinking about how you get medicated in that situation, and how she lost her children, because there's this part of it where the children come to see her, but they're now grown men. And she's like, what happened to my children? Now, this is 24 years in institutionalized. And the poem that Merle uses is, they stole my life. So how do they steal our lives? We have to push back against that. And pushing back against stealing our lives means, as we said earlier, redocumenting, re-identifying who we are and who those women are that are missing from the spectrum of things. So back to Louise Langdon Little from Grenada, the mother of Malcolm X. Think about that. Did you, I mean, we need to know that and acknowledge and recognize her and give her that space in history that she deserves.
So maybe we can take a few answers to those questions first, or should we just do a couple more questions? I'm trying to think of the most efficient way. Maybe we take 2 more questions. There's 2 there, that's perfect. And then we'll allow you guys to, and I'll remember the other ones as well. So
I'm so
first, there
embarrassed.
was 1 question there, and then where was the second hand? Right there. Okay, great.
Thank you, my sisters. I am listening. I'm listening hard. Carole, I'd like to pick up your point about when the base moves, the structure shifts. What is happening globally in our kind of community development? Because to develop that base of community in a hostile environment globally, are you confident that that is happening on a sustained basis for that structure to shift?
Thank you. And then our last
Yes, thank you. Jessica, you speak about documenting practices of old and how we can learn from them. I haven't heard much about how those practices are sustaining through the generational changes that we're seeing and modernization and cultural changes. So I'd like to hear a bit more about that and how some of the more senior leaders on the panel are beginning to prepare for that shift in power. You know, as you age, you have the younger ones nipping at your ankles, and they're not necessarily being respectful of those practices that you may have documented, Jessica. So I'd be interested to hear how you're thinking about that transitional phase.
Thank you. So we've got those 2 new questions, and not to forget that we had the one regarding how to get your power back.
Yeah.
And thank you for your sharing
That's
there.
important.
And
Yeah,
then
I wanted to
also
respond to that
the
as
one on the black woman as the most disrespected and underprotected. So please feel free to answer any of those.
Well, on the question of being disrespected and has it got any better, I don't think it's got that much better. In as much, obviously we have writers and academics like Carole and Jessica and so on, but I don't think it's got that much better. And in the sense that we are more high profile than we might have been, it's often a very sexualized image, and that's not necessarily moving us forward. In terms of power, how you get your power back, you know, we have to sort of bring our power to ourselves. But yeah, just on this question of respect, it hasn't got that much better. And it's because it hasn't got that much better that someone like Kemi thinks she has to go on with her foolishness, right? But yeah, I think in the end, only we can embrace our power and go forward. That's what I feel. And some of the things I've indicated earlier about your friends and about looking to your family and your community, those are the things that have given me a measure of power. It's not just about me and what I do or what I think. As I said, it's about my friends, it's about my family. And it's also reading and getting sort of information, understanding from what you read. So it's going to be possible to get your power back, believe me.
Yeah, I love that you said, you asked, how do I get my power back? Because it implies that you understand that you have it. And I would just say, you know, the systems that you're trying to grapple with are very deep, and they're very resourced, and they're very defended, and they're structural. So we can't win everything, or it's impossible to think that it's like a story of like constant triumph or like an upward. I mean, it would be unrealistic, right, if that happens. So it's not your fault. It's the systems of oppression that keep reinforcing themselves. So you're doing the right thing in terms of just like, you know, quieting down and trying to figure it out. And it's true, just take the space you need and be around people that you know love you. And also just acknowledge for yourself the things that you've already done, you know, because even that in itself is a massive contribution, you know. I think sometimes it's just, again, simplifying, you know, and acknowledging who you are, what you already have, and the lineage that you come from, and how powerful that is.
Right. I wanted to say that keep in mind that power is circular. That's one of the points I try to make in my book, the circularities of power. So it's not just top down, it's not just dominance and subordination, it's also circular, and it's what we bring from inside as well. So the point is not to see power as something threatening that you lose, but that is still inside, and you have to find ways then to reclaim it, to strengthen it through all the avenues that we've used historically, spiritually, right? That's been one of the big ones for us. And I don't mean churchical, as the Rastas love that term, but really more spiritual in terms of how we understand community and self and healing. And then keep in mind that it's not, sometimes we have phases where we feel disempowered, but it comes back again. So power is circular, and it's not to be seen as top down and only one way of being subordinated by it at all. And I had heard African women, and I use this in the book, they talk about menopause as the hot flashes as power surges. And I liked how that sounded. Like, power surge. I'm getting more power. And, so, I mean, that's another traditional knowledge form, right? That those women really find what is seen as negative in the West as something that they're getting, their leadership power. It's coming in. So it's a way of shifting the consciousness to understand how we embrace the world.
Love that. The book, just to ask the question, the book is actually largely about contemporary activism. So it just had to situate it in the history that came from liberation, but it's mainly about contemporary. So one thing I would just say is that we come out of a lineage, so we're not disconnected from what has happened in the so-called past. The past is with us. So the people that built the spaces and the institutions and the thinking, we then are connected to them and spend time with them and inherit it and keep it moving. So it's not disconnected. We talk about things as if they are, but they're not disconnected. Like there's a tradition, you know, that you come from, for example, in your politics that continues, right?
Yes, right.
And new generations are born into the tradition. So I think it's important to see it that way, rather than seeing it as some kind of inherent conflict or disconnected. It's not disconnected. We know each other. For example, even the professor that you're sitting next to, Professor Georgie Tsikata, who really built out an incredibly important universe of thinking around African feminist political economy, for example. And, you know, we learned from her and her thinking, the work she did at the University of Ghana, the work in building up feminist Africa, and she's here. So there's continuities, right? So it's not so disconnected. On the who should we know? Everybody. I mean, nobody's written about. We have like 5 people, right? We got books about 5 people. Like we need to.
There.
Yes, I would say like, I don't know if you've seen this film soundtrack to a coup d'etat. I would highly recommend it. But I watched it with a friend of mine who's a political scientist and knows a lot about African history. And neither of us knew this woman, André Blouin, who is from Central African Republic, but actually was sent by Sékou Touré to support Patrice Lumumba as his chief of staff. And the film looks at basically what led to the assassination of Patrice Lumumba, overlaid with this interesting American soft power initiative to get African American jazz musicians to perform across the African continent, including in Congo. And Andre Blouin is a central figure in it. So she's a very interesting woman. She actually wrote an autobiography. And again, I think it's just an interesting, some of those crumbs, as you say, are interesting to follow. As you're saying, the thing around that Malcolm X's mother was an inspiration is very common in all of these men.
Exactly.
All of them.
Mm-hmm.
So true.
And the way that it's only now with little snippets we know about Fela's mum, for example.
Of course.
Right? And the fact that she ultimately was the source of his politics. I mean, the politics came from her, you know, and shaped it. And she died for it, actually.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, I think these are the things that I just like follow the breadcrumbs back and then see what you can find.
Well, we've really done our best to put the world to rights today. I think, yeah. This has been such an amazing conversation, and, you know, the questions from the audience as well. And I'm just thinking, you know, one of the things that has really struck me, sort of just as a summary to this, not just in what has been said, but what has been felt here. And it's the power of collectivism, and not just the action, but actually the communion. Mm-hmm. You know, this very session is a communion in itself, an opportunity to sit. We talked about self-care, and then the collective care that comes with that, the healing that can come with that. I think one of the most powerful things for me, also working as a feminist political economist, is the power of communion with others within the collectives that I work with. I belong to an amazing collective of feminist economists working on macroeconomics on the continent, based out of Nairobi, the Nawi Collective. And in all honesty, I probably would have broken down at multiple points over the last 10, 15 years if I did not have collectives like this. And the Nawi Collective has been the one that has saved me on occasions when we go into those spaces of power, where we meet an emotional violence, you know, and contestation to who you are in your essence as you try to shape a new world, a new reality. So find collectives, find communions, whether it's in spaces like this or whether it's in healing practices, you know, find that and connect and touch and feel, because hopefully today has given us a little bit more juice for that long-term optimism that we all need. And I am eternally grateful to you, all of you, for bringing that into the space today. So thank you.
Thank you very much.
So Annie Domingo is going to actually give us a wrap-up of today with a vote of thanks. A wrap-up.
We don't want to finish. It's been such a wonderful evening, and I'm sure that everybody here has received some goodness. Somebody talked about juice. We've got some juice to take out of here. I would first of all like to thank our host, the British Library, and particularly Jonah Albert, who has been very, very helpful and has made us all feel very comfortable in their space. And I would also like to thank SIDENSI, the colleagues, and for their support and their engagement in this wonderful evening. Just getting, look at the panel, look at being able to get these amazing women here. And I thank them. I thank you lot for your questions. So it's been so insightful, both in the house, here, and online. So thank you for participating, for engaging, and for making us feel that whatever the panel has to offer has been well received gratefully. I would also like to thank the various people who have supported us to get it to this point. We must think about ourselves. I would like to thank everybody here because we are powerful. We must remember that when we talk about Black women and bringing power to the world, it's not just the people who are on stage, not the people who we see their names on papers and on television. As the panels have said, every single mother that brings up their child to know who they are is a leader. and is powerful. So I thank all of you for the power that you have brought to this room and for the power that you're going to take out and pass on, not only to your children, but to your community, to the people that you see, the people that you meet. And lastly, but certainly not leastly, I would like to thank this amazing panel for their inspirational talk. I would like to thank Honorable Diane Abbott MP, Professor Carole Boyce Davies, who has come all the way over from the States and only arrived this morning. So thank you for making it for us. Jessica Horn, and of course, our esteemed facilitator, Fatimah Kelleher. Thank you. Good job. I would also like to say that the novels, the books, the 3 panel members, their books are outside. So please buy, read, enjoy, and I'm sure that if you're quick, they will be able to sign it for you as well. Quick. So it's up to you. Run! Get those pocketbooks out, get the cards out, and buy. So thank you, and thank you. Thank you, everybody.